should probably ask who you are.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I know who you are, but for the benefit of anybody that
yes. So my name is Abhi. To introduce, my name is full full name Abhishek Banik. I come from India, Calcutta. Studied in India my undergrad biotechnology, and then went to Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh to study my master's brewing and distilling. And people do ask me time to time, how did you end up doing that course? And I always say it's by chance. It's by mistake, I think, to be very frank. When I was doing my undergrad biotechnology, I was studying industrial microbiology. I was quite keen into fermentation from pharmaceutical point of view. So when I came across a course, I thought I'll read about fermentation. I like distillation, but never thought I'll get into the alcohol industry. Yeah, but that's when I joined the course. It drew me straight into distillation, especially gin, because I liked cooking, use of herbs, spices, and creating something, blending distillation, and to create a flavored product. It drew me straight into it. So I did my master's project on gin development as well. Then carried on teaching, doing PhD in distillation related stuff. And not widely known, I did a lot of knowledge transfer protocol in Scotland, where uh, helped many small distilleries and breweries to evaluate their process from technical terms, and created new product development. We did new product development with them. We have analyzed their process to make them more efficient and effective, uh, both flavor as well as from energy and raw material use. We have done several projects on alcohol recovery in breweries, uh, to see if we can create sensible alcohol that could be sold as spirits. So a lot of those projects. And then finally met you during one of the teaching classes in Heriot-Watt, laboratory distillation. And then we together joined and created Copper River Distillery.
I like how you say finally, as though it's the end.
No, it's the end of the teaching career
Yeah.
and the start of
Well, that
making.
phase of your teaching career.
Yes, yeah.
So it's fair to say you're a bit of a geek. Like half of what you just talked about, I didn't understand what you were saying.
Yes, well, I am a geek when it comes to the technicality,
Yeah.
problem solving, creating, yeah, in that kind. Yeah.
And how would you characterize my um, level of knowledge in brewing, distillation, and whiskey?
Well, you have come a long way, but especially when we met, you're an infant, I would have said, but a very wise infant because you knew what you have to do, what you have to learn. Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that's polite characterization. Let's say that I am like a lot of people, even my age, even in my advanced years, new to whiskey, new to distillation, and very much at the, I would say, beginning of my journey in whiskey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why we're doing this podcast, isn't it? To break some things down and also to bring more people into the world of whiskey that we love.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think um, I through these years, I've kind of seen all of those things that in the world of whiskey in particular are just jargon, and they're just words,
Mhm.
like and really important words like, oh, copper's so important, but nobody ever, it's quite rare that somebody then says, and this is the reason why. um, and then even for people who are way further on in their journey in whiskey than I am, that then understand the role of, let's say, copper, for instance. There's actually even further you can go in that, like what is actually happening in chemistry
Mhm.
terms when copper interacts with the liquid
Yeah.
to purify it as it is, or or the other one is wood, or there's hot stills and continuous stills, and there's so much little bits of jargon that I think that we've got an opportunity, given your deep knowledge and the journey that we've been on together, to share and break it down and talk about things in terms that people who are early in their journey can follow and can learn a bit more, but also those that are much further on in their journey but are super interested. I think you're almost uniquely placed to get geeky and go into it, and I think that's what we wanted to do here, and just share that knowledge. And
Yeah, well, I'm still learning, but this is a great opportunity. I quite like to talk about whiskey as well. So
yeah, cool. All right. So what do we want to do? What do you think is the most important, or interesting? We've looked recently at the role of water and whiskey. You always get that question, where does your water come from? We, copper is beautiful, and copper stills are iconic, and we know that copper plays an important role in making whiskey. We've looked at that quite closely recently. How long do you age your whiskey for, and the role of age and whiskey, I think it's quite interesting. And another question we get a lot is, what type of casks do you age your whiskey in? I mean, we can also talk about the end-to-end process as an open. What do you think is potentially the most interesting for us to get into?
I would think we should talk about grains.
Grain.
Yeah.
That's not on. I literally just went through a list, and that wasn't on the list.
Well, I'm adding that in the list. The reason is we both are unprepared on it, so we'll ask some simple questions about it and we'll answer it.
Yeah.
As exactly what you say, there are people out there who do not know anything about it.
Okay.
Right? So to create a small session on grain that we can then go ahead and make it bigger.
Okay. All right.
So this is the Q&A type of question.
You want to start with grain?
Yes. I know I would have going to
We can
choose a
do-
copper, but I thought because we are both not prepared, it will be quite looking into it, something that nobody has talked before. And then we'll prepare a session, go deep into it.
There's nobody talked about it because they're not interested in it.
They're not interested in it. Yes. It is very true.
Is that the best content to start with?
Yeah, I think so, because nobody talks about it, nobody's interested about it, but they need to know why it is important.
Is that going to get us a lot of clicks?
It's going to get us a lot of clicks.
Even though no one's interested in it?
I'm telling you, it's going to get us more clicks.
Okay. All right. I'll go with it. Let's start with grain. I mean, grain is by definition fundamental to whiskey, because I mean, I might be wrong, but is it fair to say that every regulation that we're aware of globally dictates that it cannot be whiskey unless it's made with grain and water, usually? Is that right?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah.
Is there anywhere where you can make whiskey and call it whiskey that you're aware of by using, I don't know, rice or sugarcane or potatoes or?
No, whiskey has to be always made of grain.
Yeah. Okay, grain. Okay, so what do we mean by grain? I mean, are all grains equal?
So now there are different kind of grains that is used in the whiskey world. For example, the most well known is barley, wheat, and maize corns, and we have got rye. So these are the biggest, the four grains that is widely used all over the world.
Yeah.
And that's what people know of. But another thing to know about is that we're talking about whiskey as general. Now, if you're going to go more specific in a way, now malt whiskey. Now that has to be produced from grain that has been malted. So that straight away takes certain things off. For example, corn. So there is no corn whiskeys available that is a single malt.
Is that because you can't like the malting process doesn't work for corn?
Yes, yeah. So malting process doesn't work for corn. So that is why typically single malts are produced all over the world only from barley, but you can malt wheat, you can malt rye as well. But because of downstream production process difficulty, mainly single malts are made from barley.
Okay, let's put a pin in, like you've used the word malt
Yeah,
and maltings
yeah,
several times there.
yeah.
And I think let's put a pin in those words, because that is in a way separate from grain.
Mm-hmm.
But they're words that are, you know, it's fundamentally important. Single malt whiskey,
Mm-hmm.
like I think I would love to know more about what is malting
Mm-hmm.
anyway. What does it do? Why is it important?
Yeah.
But maybe let's go back to those different. So you said corn, maize, barley, wheat, and rye as the kind of the big four.
Yeah.
Each of those, I'm guessing, like, why would you use one versus the other? What's the point, and what's the difference between them?
So these all different grains actually produces different kind of flavor.
Right.
So the attributes that wheat will give is way different than what barley is going to give to you. And rye, as we know, that rye gives very huge influence on herbal spicy elements in the recipe.
So herbal spicy elements, what does that, how does that, what do you mean by that? So when I drink a whiskey, where am I feeling that, and how am I feeling that when I drink it?
So when you're drinking whiskey, if you're drinking a 100% barley-based single malt, it's going to be quite soft, sweet, has got nutty elements. But then when you have wheat influence in it, then you'll start getting creamier, more creamier elements. Okay. And then if you have rye influence in it, you'll get sweet and spicy element flowing through with the whiskey, with the creaminess. So from sweet, nutty to more creamier whiskey, lighter, to a rich and spicy whiskey is going to be from rye. Now here we're talking about without any influence of the barrel.
Right.
Right? Because the barrel can also give a lot of influence. So here from the grain itself, sweet, simple, creamy, sweet whiskey, creamier, more vanilla element with wheat, and rye is spicy, like cinnamony elements in there, and a little of gingery element. That's what the rye is going to bring.
Okay, so what is the influencing factor in a grain that gives it like the sweetness? What is it about it, and does that influence, like, so like could I use any wheat, or are there
So
some wheats that I can use for making whiskey and others that don't really work for whiskey? And if that's the case, what is it, what's going on in those that is the difference?
right now, to understand that, this is the beautiful part of the grains that's why I picked up grain to talk about. Is if you think about bread, right? Typically, you go and buy bread and you eat it, and you see different bread has got different flavor. But majority of those breads are made from wheat, but different variety of wheat. So each variety of wheat has got a different composition of proteins, which actually provide flavors, right? Breakdown of those proteins to amino acids that react with alcohol to create esters, if you think. So different kind of proteins will break down into different kind of amino acids, and then you produce different kind of congeners. Same across all of the grains.
You're gonna have to put, right. So different types of, so the flavor comes from the protein.
Protein part of it, yes.
Interesting. So the protein breaks into amino acids,
Yeah.
and the amino acids
Will react it with alcohol to,
reacts with the ethanol.
yes, and it'll produce different esters.
Okay, what's an ester?
So esters are the flavor active compound that creates the flavors. The when you're drinking, you feel, oh, this it's like fruity, that is floral, okay, this is spicy. That is all because of the esters that is produced during the production process. Some esters are already produced by yeast, okay. Some esters are produced during distillation, and that's where the importance of copper come into picture, because the esters or even the precursors of the esters that came from the grains are then converted, reacting with alcohol and other esters to create secondary esters, which secondary flavors. That's why all those precursors that comes from the raw material are so important, because that get converted all throughout the process during fermentation, actually during brewing, fermentation, distillation, and far more happens during maturation as well.
So, I mean, what I find interesting about that is I'd always thought if we think about what is, so to make whiskey we have to first take the grain, we're going to mill it for the for the purposes of like building up the picture, we're going to mill it into a grist, we're going to add hot water, and that hot water is going to extract what we need then later to convert. We're going to take that extract, which is a bit like a super liquid porridge in a way,
Yep.
isn't it? It's sweet, and then we're going to put that into fermentation tanks and add yeast. The yeast is going to, and this is where I've kind of hadn't really thought about the protein influence before, because for me, we're talking about distillation. So the yeast is going to interact and consume the carbohydrate element,
Yep.
the sugar bit, and is going to excrete the ethanol, the alcohol, which we always kind of think of as or I always think of as then an important bit, because ultimately we're making an alcoholic drink.
Yep.
What you're saying is that from a flavor perspective, the more important bit is not the carbohydrate,
No.
but
Yep.
is the protein element. And I'd always thought, oh well, the type of grain you're going to go for has got more carbohydrate than protein, because it's the carbohydrate we're interested in as distillers.
So in a general format, yeah, different grains will have different compositions that affects the flavor that the grain attributes to, right? But there are more than, if you think about now how carbohydrate influences is based on the mouthfeel. So whiskey that is made from wheat will have a much more creamier mouthfeel than the whiskey that is made from malted barley,
Because
then the carbohydrate that you have and the alcohol produced from that. So alcohol and water, there's two molecules, they're attached to each other, and that structure of that alcohol is actually quite different. Now I do not know, I've not studied more in details about the structure of the alcohol,
yeah,
but they are proven that the alcohol produced from wheat and the alcohol produced from barley have a different mouthfeel in your palate. That's the reason, because when you break down those carbohydrates, okay, it produces different alcohol and water molecule, how this sits together. It has a different spatial structure, and that creates a different mouthfeel. So that is why, even if you try, now moving a little bit away from, to make it relevant, a little bit away from whiskey, if you think potato vodka has got a different mouthfeel than a wheat-based vodka. So when we're talking about what starch does, influences flavor wise as a raw material, that's a carbohydrate, and what it does creates a different kind of alcohol water structure that have a different mouthfeel.
so just for the purposes, so a famous wheat-based vodka would be
Will be famous grouse. No, famous grouse whiskey. Grey Goose.
Grey Goose.
Yeah.
And a famous potato-based vodka would be,
Well, from UK, you can talk about Ogilvy, or from worldwide, well known, you can talk about Chopin.
okay, Chopin. And then I suppose what Belvedere is barley. Is that right? Should
Belvedere,
be, because that's a barley.
I think Belvedere might be barley, yes.
So that's quite interesting. So in a way, you could, if you want to dig into, uh, I mean, it feels like a tangent, but I see that it's a relevant tangent. If you want to dig into the influence of grain on mouthfeel
Exactly.
without the distraction of, well, at least the barrel, and then we know that down the line there's a lot of other things as well, then picking like a Chopin for potato, a
Wheat based
Belvedere, and
and
then a
and a malt based or barley based.
is quite a good way of doing it. And
And you
that's definitely something that we always talk about here, because of the, with the way that we do our vodka, it's like this is almost the purest expression
yes.
of the way those grains are, when they're turned into pure or near pure ethanol, right?
Yeah. So this is why I think making whiskey, you can't only study whiskey. You need to study about every other kind of spirit that is produced from grains, because different production aims for or demands different things. So vodka mainly demands mouthfeel, okay, while the whiskey demands congeners as well. So that's when we see how the grains can be used to create both the mouthfeel and flavor. That's we talk about whiskey. That's we need to understand vodka production. So that's why I said let's talk about grains, because you will draw each and every element of distillation process or production process to understand when you talk about grades.
So let's go back to the four, right? I think it feels like we went quite deep and
Mhm.
quite technical, but so wheat, barley, maize, corn maize, and rye.
Mhm.
Wheat and barley, well, barley in particular, I think, given because of single malt, it's something that I would say, particularly in this country, being we're in the UK, a lot of people that, whiskey people will have had a lot of experience with.
Mhm.
Um, wheat a bit less so. Um, what about corn maize? What are we,
Flavor wise.
yeah, what are we getting from that? And which type of whiskey do we normally see it in? Because I don't think we can really even grow. Can we grow that effectively here? The corn?
Yes, so corn, maize and corn, till 1980s, 85, I think, 83 or 85, that's when it got switched. Not sure about the reason, I didn't study on that. But grain whiskey in Scotland, they were using almost 80% corn and 20%, 10 to 20% of malted barley, 80 to 90% of corn. So grain whiskies pre 1980s would most probably will have corn. Wheat was also there, but corn was extensively produced. Corn is still produced in UK, but mainly goes into animal feed.
Yeah.
But yeah, huge amount of corn was used at that time.
Okay, but so what are we get? What is it giving us then?
So when you typically drink corn whiskey, or let's say corn-based spirit
Yeah.
versus whiskey-based spirit, you will find corn-based spirit is a bit thinner in mouthfeel, but much more sweeter. Okay, it is pretty much like syrup, you know.
Right.
And on the flavor note wise, what you typically think when you think about corn, you're going to get that, that sweet, popcorny, butterscotchy, popcorny flavor. Yeah. So sometime could be associated to diacetyl kind of flavor. So those are the flavors.
Die what?
Diacetyl. So this is a flavor which relates to uh, buttered popcorn.
Right.
Yeah. So that is a kind of flavor that is associated to corn.
And when we talk about corn, I mean, like, if without being too much of a noob, is corn on the cob?
Yeah.
Is that are we looking at basically that, or is it a different variety of corn, or?
There are huge varieties of corn, and they all produces different kind of flavors. So it's quite interesting. So last time I went to a whiskey show, and we're trying all these American whiskeys, right? And there's, I think, 3 or 4 different American whiskey brand over there, and I'm very drawn to it to understand flavor, right?
Yeah.
So, and I tried 5 or 6 different whiskeys, and each of them are talking about they're making their specific whiskey from this variety of corn that is from that location. That's when you talk about
Right.
terroir and the variety and the flavor that brings. And it was so different from each brand to other brand. You can see the flavor that corn has to give.
So in all these years, knowing what a sweet tooth I've got when it comes to whiskey, I don't think you've ever given me a corn whiskey, which sounds like a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of a slight of some sort, but we can redress that.
No, certainly. I have not given you a corn whiskey or even tried making one in here, because then again, drawing why talking about grain is important. Now, here we talk about process of production, right? And why single malt is widely produced using malted barley is because when it comes to brewing, single malts are most easiest in the way of brewing if you have a mash tun or a lauter tun. Okay, so the setup, how you create, is much more simpler. When I say simple, there is much more technicality in it. But when I say the runoff wise, handling spent grain wise, the kind of equipment you need, complexity wise, is much more approachable making single malt. But when it comes to rye, and when it comes to corn, it has own challenges. So for example, when it comes to corn, because how it arrives, you have to pressure cook it most of the time, and then it creates a slurry, then it becomes a difficult to run off. So you need a completely different kind of system to do brewing with corn. And if you think about, look in America, and sometime in Canada as well, where they make corn whiskies, they typically do not have a lauter tun. They are all on grain fermentation and then distillation. Same
Right.
comes with rye.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
this is why.
yeah. So give me just so that I can address my need to now try corn whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
Have you got off the top of your head any any brands of whiskey that are using corn, or large variety of corn?
I
So large proportion of corn, let's call it that, rather than variety.
uh, I I think we should leave that for another talk, the corn-based wise, because that is much more specifically flavored.
It's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing to itself,
Okay,
flavor-wise.
let's move. Okay, so corn. So let's then talk about rye, because so when you get a rye whiskey, what is it? It's like 100% rye, or is it?
Many people have started doing 100% rye, but majority of the time, I think people uses rye was only popularized because of American and Canadian whiskeys, right? So there, I think they're talking about, to be called a rye whiskey, straight rye, it has to have 51% rye. So you do not need to have 100% rye. But there are whiskeys out there now which the craft industry has brought in. Well, the rye is 100%. Yeah, so very few rye whiskeys is there as 100% rye.
And it's like there's a thing. So for me, this is, there is a thing in whiskey. Let's just imagine that the world was only Scotch,
Mhm.
okay? And when you first talk to somebody who's a little bit into whiskey, maybe maybe not somebody that loves whiskey so much that they love every type of whiskey, right? They have their preferred style of whiskey, and the it's almost like a dichotomy, I find, is that you have people that love peated whiskey and people that don't love peated whiskey, to say the least. Um, as a bit of a dichotomy. Now, obviously, the peated whiskey is not so much about the grain, it's about the process. But from my limited experience of rye whiskey,
Mm.
I could almost say that it's a bit the same, right? Rye whiskey has got a very particular like impact when you drink it, and it feels to me like that is also one of those, but only because of the grain, not necessarily the process, that you got the people that love rye whiskey and then the people that
Not a big fan
love
of.
it a bit
Yeah,
less,
yeah.
or not at all.
Yeah.
And is that something that yeah, is that something you can understand, like the impact of that flavor?
So yes, so impact of that flavor is huge. That's why there are two ways of using rye, and the distilleries, they choose what impact they want to use, right? So, for example, if you're using straight rye, unmalted, okay, it brings the more herbal note. But if you use it malted rye, it brings the spicy note with nutty elements, nutty chocolatey elements, not the herbal spice. Now you've got a nutty chocolate. So, for example, nutmeg, if you think about as a spice, okay, on the nose, what it is actually nutty spicy. Uh, but at the same time, if you think about sarsaparilla, another green herb, which is like cubeb berries, another example, which has got spicy but herbal element.
Okay.
So this are the two flavors that a distillery then choose.
Sarsaparilla.
Yeah. Or is there
I've
some?
definitely, I use that all the time. I've never used it once in cooking. Let's
Okay, let's
look
say
for
cubeb
another one.
berries. Cubeb berries.
Cuba berries, also never. Keep
Uh,
going, keep going. Let's find a spice that I've actually heard of and used.
herbal spice, herbal and spicy. Oh, like okay, it is not exactly, but if you think about rocket,
Okay.
it is spicy,
Yeah,
right? On the nose,
pepper.
peppery element.
Got
But
it.
is that black pepper or is it like greenish kind of pepper? So that's what I'm trying to say. The rocket smell.
For some of us,
Yeah,
there is pepper
yeah.
and there is not pepper.
Okay.
There is not all of us have white, green, black. But anyway, just saying
Yeah.
there
So
might
I
be.
think what I mean is like cinnamon as a spicy nose, rocket as a spicy nose. Can you see the difference? Cinnamon is not green
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
spicy, and rocket is not dry, fruity, spicy. So that's what malted and unmalted rye is going to bring, right? Now, a distillery chooses, impact, as you said, like the peat, they chooses what they want to bring in their whiskey for their flavor profile. Am I going the right direction to the question?
Well, I think that's, in a way, rounding it back, that is exactly one of the key points of, talking about grain in general is, with grain as the fundamental ingredient in all whiskey,
Yeah.
and then seeing that each grain has got different components, whether it's the protein or you as a distiller choose what type of whiskey you want to deliver and what experience you want to deliver. Or as a consumer, what I want to experience, and you can kind of go right back to the source, which is the grain.
Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about malting.
Yeah.
That is a whole topic, I think,
It is. Yeah.
which I think we'll come back to. At the basic level, let's talk about the grain level rather than the style of malting.
Yeah.
What is malting, and what does it do to the grain?
So if you think about when you take a seed and you put it in the ground, and in few weeks' time you see it starts growing. That is what malting is making the seed things that they need to become a plant.
Okay.
Okay. What does seed holds is an embryo, sorry, and sugar source for the embryo to grow into a plant.
Okay.
Right. Now, the sugar source is a carbon source for the embryo to grow, is trapped in such a way that it doesn't get damaged and it's readily available for the embryo. So embryo has got some tools to get access to the sugar source. Okay, that is enzymes. So the embryo, when it needs the sugar source, it will create certain enzymes to go and attack the pockets which is holding the sugar for them. And that enzyme breaks those pockets, breaks and releases the starch, the sugar source to them. So during malting process, that's what is happening. The embryo is becoming active, understanding it has to grow and become a plant. It starts creating those enzymes so it can then start getting access to that sugar. So
Yeah.
that will help them to grow. That is molting, activating the embryo to start creating those enzymes that can go and break down the proteins around which is protecting the sugar source. But we do it only up to the level that there is enough amount of enzymes produced. What's the reason for that? Because in single malt, now if you think about as an example, we do not add any enzyme to the brewing to get access to that starch. That's the starch that the yeast, so the starch and then converting them into sugar is what the yeast is going to consume to make alcohol. So during malting, the biggest target for us is create enough enzyme by the embryo so that during the brewing process will break down the starch into sugar and make it available for yeast. So malting is nothing but activating the embryo to think it has to grow. It produces enough enzyme, then you capture the grain in that moment by halting the growth process by what we call kilning, and then we use it for brewing. So malting process will include soaking that activates or start thinking the embryo that I need to grow. Then germination, which means they starts to grow. Formation of root and shoot. Okay, but just enough. Then we do kill to stop them to grow. Okay, and capture the enzyme in the grain. So then we can bring it to a distillery, mash in, like a millet, mash in, and do the brewing process. So that's malting.
Cool. So we've talked about the 4 types of grain. We've talked about the influence of malting and what malting is. I guess one of the things that we're picking up more and more, well, I think the first wave of grain, digging into grain in the industry that was a slight departure from the traditional was organic.
Yeah.
Then I think we started to see terroir. Where is the grain grown? And now we start to see heritage grain.
Yes.
As a thing. I appreciate maybe terroir and organic is in a way closer to each other, and then heritage grain is a slightly different thing. But you know, what if anything do you think that organic is giving to the whiskey? Why am I asking that? Does organic give something to the whiskey, or does it give something to the consumer and the world, I guess?
So I don't think there is enough research out there to say what is the influence of organic grains on a spirit product, flavor wise and mouthfeel. Organic has always been, the movement of organic was always to create a healthier product without the use of artificial pesticides and fertilizers. So that is the organic movement, and its influence on spirit world, I think it has not been tested enough. So I do not have much data
From
on
a
it.
flavor perspective.
From flavor
Yeah, yeah.
perspective. From health perspective, maybe. Same way about the heritage. If we think about what has happened in the world of grains across all these years, we have started, I think, harvesting, growing our grains. It's not 100 years old; it's 1,000 years old. Yeah, more than 1,000 years old that the
More than
humans
that, yeah.
Has been harvesting grains. But all throughout this journey, what we have done is what we say natural selection. We put the natural selection of the grain to find out what grains survives the best. Okay, But when we say survives the best, what is our goal? It's quantity. It has always been. Okay, how can we get more wheat out of a harvest? How can we get more alcohol from that harvest? So the drive has always been quantity, right? That is why what they're calling now heritage varieties
Or
they're bringing in.
which grain substrain survives better in bad weather,
Exactly.
which one survives better in soil that is ever reducing in nitrogen levels that helps it grow, which one is going to give you the best yield when in maltings or whatever.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
so the yield has always been the motivation in our selection, right? But now people have realized,
Just to be clear,
yeah,
not our selection.
no, not ours. What I mean is, like, as an industry,
Yeah.
as humanity, actually, it is not only the distilling
It's a
industry.
function of industrialization, isn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And also, we all has benefited from that, or else if we haven't, our harvest will be low, our food cost will be high, so a human
Yeah.
being has created that need, that's what. But then people has realized that certain variety of flavor, certain variety of grains have a different influence in flavor. So for example, it's one of the biggest talk in the industry in brewing as well. Still, Maris Otter. Maris Otter, people just loves the flavors of Maris Otter.
What is Maris? What
It's a Maris Otter is a variety of barley.
Okay.
Okay. Now there are people who is a blind follower of Maris Otter and the flavor it brings. It brings a really lovely flavor for sure. Yeah. But then Maris Otter might only have a efficiency of, let's say, 85% compared to the variety that we use, which is now globally used. When I say global, I didn't mean worldwide, which I mean as a distilling industry
Generally.
generally used is Laureate, let's say, for example, and it might change. It was Concerto before, but Maris Otter is known for its flavor, not its extract value, right? So this is what has happened on the grain front. So heritage grains now that people are bringing, they are flavor front. You are not going to expect same amount of extract. Okay, there might be in future work to make those heritage grains more what do you call, to produce more alcohol, but then needs work. But as of now, what is happening in the world about heritage grains and all is to bring those flavors back at the cost of the yield.
So what about terroir? There's not a huge amount going on with terroir, but there are a couple of quite well noted distilleries, and terroir is this idea which is coming really from wine, which is to say, if I grow my grain, well, in wine, it's if I grow my grape uh, in this type of soil with this type of climatic conditions and this amount of sunlight, then my grape is going to turn out in a particular way. And there is a very small, but nevertheless a movement which says, well, if it's true for grape, then it must be true for grain. And we can create different types of whiskey based on where and the conditions that we grow the grains in. What do we I mean, what do you think about that?
Let's understand something, or let's break down the production processes so that people can at least understand the influence of terroir on anything, right? So let's see grapes as an example. Terroir is important. Different soil structure have a different mineral content, and when the plant draws those water, it draws with the minerals as well, and then it gets stored in the fruits or the grains and the seeds. Now let's take grape as an example. I do not know the exact quantity, but I will think grape has got at least 90% plus water content, right? And let's take the grape, and what do we do to make wine? We crush it, take the liquid, that liquid part of it, we take it. Do we dilute it with anything? No.
Well,
That's what we drink. So all the water.
all we do actually is add yeast,
Yes.
convert some of the sugars
Into alcohol.
into alcohol.
Yeah.
And then depending on whether or not it's a, if it's a, if it's a Bordeaux, then it will go into casks and it will be aged. But
Yeah.
actually for most of the wine that we drink, it's pretty much drawn off and we drink it as it is.
Yes.
So all it is grape juice, yeast, and then drawn off with the alcohol.
So the liquid part of wine is actually the water from the soil at different terroirs. So terroir in wine is important, and we can draw. Everybody can draw link to it. How different area produce different wine. Now let's look grain. Typically, when a grain is harvested, first of all, while growing the grain, many places do practice based on how much of moisture is there in the soil around. They might spray water, which is the groundwater itself from that area, from the terroir. Or some places they do not practice spraying water. But think about now the grain is drawing that water from the soil, same way like grapes. When the grain is harvested, the amount of water in the grain is 15% compared to 90% in grapes. Okay, then that goes into brewing, let's say. But now look into malting, what happens if it is going into malting? We have this 15% moisture that is typically reduced to 12% for safekeeping. Then they soak it with water, right?
Exogenous water.
Exogenous water, which actually most of the time filtered and all out of minerals and all. So the barley will have from 12% goes up to 50% almost. I'm not sure exact number in moisture content. So that means the water it actually had from the soil has been diluted 3 times over there. And then they drain it. Okay. Then they do the water process again. So while drained it, it'll fall down to 45, from 50 to 45. So you lost a little bit of water, and then you put back again in soak. Again, it absorbs another 5% water. So it's got further diluted, right? After that, we send it for kilning. We dry that water to 5%. So if we started with 15% water, again to 50, so dilution by 1/3. Now we have got 5% of the soil water left in it, right? Now we start brewing process. We take, let's say, 100 kilograms of malt, which has got 5% of the water from the soil in it left. So, which is 105, so 5 liters of water is from that soil. And for 100 kilograms, we'll put 400 liters of water, wherever you're brewing, from your ground or anything. 5, 400. How many times dilation is that? That is 20, 80 times dilution. I do not know how can I trace back the flavor from that soil after it has been diluted 80 times and then brewed. And then we have got fermentation going on, distillation, barrel maturation. So the impact of that grain, the water they absorbed from that soil, technically been reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced. So I think that it needs more work to relate that minuscule amount of minerals that is left in it, how its impact on the flavor. So that is my take on impact of terroir. Okay, I will leave it to people if they have got more understanding on terroir, but I think I'm still learning to see if it had got influence in the flavor.
You're on the fence, to
Uh,
put it lightly.
but
Yeah,
because
I mean, I sort of without necessarily going into the maths of distillation, which by the way I think is a topic in itself, which is quite interesting. Kind of, I start with this amount of grain,
yeah,
and then I end up with this amount of whiskey. Like there's
yeah,
there's quite a nice flow
yeah,
of maths through that, and we'll do that another time. Without going into that, I kind of look at it. I'm like, okay, well, I'm not sure. It's very difficult, just because of the number of influences down the line.
exactly.
Leave aside, the percentage of water that is drawn from the ground, which I hadn't even really thought about because that's fundamental. But without, I think the element of terroir which could be interesting from a consumer perspective. It's more like I'm an economist, right? So I think in terms of utility, right? It doesn't have to be flavor. I can still get utility from something, benefit from something that's not just flavor. Is the simple fact of knowing where something is grown, which in a way goes back to what you were saying about organic or heritage, where it's almost like a deindustrialization.
Exactly.
And wind the clock back to the time when well, probably never in our lifetime, because of where we've grown up, or and most people that might look at this, where we knew the person that made what we consume, and we knew where they got what they used to make that thing. And there's a little bit of that, and then of course other point of which gives me a very, very soft utility, and then perhaps a more concrete one, which is, okay, now I can make a judgment about how far from the distillery that thing was grown, and I can make a judgment about the implicit carbon impact, and what my bottle of whiskey is doing, ultimately to the world, just from the like embedded carbon footprint of growing it here and moving it to here and distilling it, with a malting in between. So that's quite interesting.
Now, I would want to mention, that's why grain is such an important topic, is there's another element in the grain, in the chain, that influences flavor. And that also includes the malting process as well, is the last step of malting is kilning, as I said. It's drying the grains, right? And different drying process temperature will create a different kind of malt and flavor. So for example, now typically practiced on barley itself, malting.
I think you're getting into malting.
Yes, no. I'm just giving a snippet in here now. Yeah, snippet, just a snippet in here. You can create a different kind of malt to create different kind of flavors. Now, when we talk more into it, then we talk, but that's when grains are so important.
I see.
When it comes to flavor, okay, that is one singular biggest impact on any flavor that you have is grains, is interaction during brewing, is interaction also. There is another compound in grain, which is very important, is the nitrogen. Okay, now influence of nitrogen creates a different brewing fermentation profile, because nitrogen is nothing but nutrient for the yeast. So having that, what quantity free nitrogen or combined nitrogen, yeast reacts differently. And the yeast produces sulfur during fermentation process based on the amount of nutrients it has. Okay, so then that sulfur, it will react with copper. The influence of copper in whiskey then becomes relevant. But all comes down to because the amount of nitrogen in the grain. So you see, if you want to talk about copper, we need to say why it is important and when it comes to grain. So it is very important that you make the nitrogen source and the proteins. It is in the grain that influences those compounds production in fermentation. Then that needs copper in the process.
So what I mean, I think you're right. We will come on to nitrogen in particular, but okay, when did I stop doing I was 16 the last time I did chemistry. Okay. So the most I know about, let's say, chemical interactions in liquids, I know a bit about osmosis, and I know a bit about acidity and alkalinity, but I don't know much about single, atomic level, atoms, or molecules, and what they do through a process. So how does nitrogen influence interactions? Does it affect acidity, alkalinity? Is it what's the lens that we're looking through?
So when it comes to minerals in the or composition of the grain that influences a flavor or how it influences, I think we should keep that for the day we talk about yeast. Because at the end of the day, all these things will be influencing the brewing and the fermentation, and then what it does downstream. So when we talk about the yeast, we'll talk about nitrogen. We'll talk about how the starch, how we talked about how different starch from different grains creates a different mouthfeel. We'll talk about that as well. And we'll also talk about other congener creations that yeast actually helps. We briefly touched about amino acids. Yeast is a big source of that amino acid when it's the flavor creation in whiskey. Okay, so this is why if you distill with yeast and if you distill without yeast, it produces different flavor. So let's keep the influence of the minerals and the grain count or different grain compositions, how it influences the flavor for the day we talk about yeast.
Used another word there that I didn't. What's congener?
So congener is the flavor active compounds. Okay, so it is impurities in a spirit, which is produced by the yeast as a byproduct. But it is a congener that makes whiskey different from each other, because that is the flavor active compounds.
So is a congener an influencing factor on an ester?
Yeah, I mean,
Because I understood from what you said earlier that is esters are what give us the difference in flavors. Now you're telling me it's the congeners.
congeners is the group of all the compounds together, including esters and other heavy oils and alcohol. We term them together as congener. That is the flavor. So congener is composed of esters, heavier alcohols, and other things that gives any spirit the flavor.
So there's light alcohol and heavy alcohol.
Yes, based on what is the size of the molecule.
Okay. And what about oil?
Yes, oils as well produced by yeast.
Okay.
It's
I think we'll have to go into that as well. I mean,
yes. When
what
we
you've
talk about
described as a
yeast, yeah,
congener,
yeah,
it sounds like that is, like there's a whole lot going on inside a congener.
yes,
Is a
profile.
congener a thing? Can I do that with a congener?
Yes, it is. It
Does it
is.
look like that under a microscope?
No, you can't see congeners under microscope.
They're ethereal.
They are chemical compounds. You can see them under a GCMS analysis.
Okay, what's a GCMS analysis?
Gas chromatography. So when you analyze the chemical composition, so it's not an organism, but it's a group of chemical compounds that we termed under congener, that we term based on the flavors. And we do congener analysis of a whiskey or of a spirit.
Ethereal.